This meeting will come to order. Today is Tuesday, September 27, 2016. This is a study session for the Prescott City Council. We've got a pretty busy schedule today. Roll call, please.
Mayor Oberg.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Lamerson.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Lazell.
Here.
Councilwoman Orr. Here. Councilman Shiska.
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Here.
All present.
I want to thank everybody for coming today and helping us out in trying to finalize the work on these two ordinances that we have on the agenda. If you didn't have a chance, the agenda's over there at the door. I do have our CFO today, Chief Financial Officer Mark Whitfield, filling in for City Manager Craig McConnell. Item A, please.
Item A, discussion of structured sober living homes or draft ordinance.
Okay. Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. I think it's welcome to version or meeting 5, I think, maybe 6 of the council. And then just for the record, we've also had a number of discussions about this particular topic at the ad hoc committee as well. So today I'm going to attempt to be brief and talk really just about the changes to the ordinance that the council saw 2 weeks ago. For the public, maybe we can if we get the light up there, up on the screen, please. All right, here we go. Okay, so at the last meeting, the council looked at really sort of the substantive provisions of the ordinance, what the actual regulations are. Today, what you have in front of you is a draft ordinance, a full draft ordinance, which has all of the recital provisions, what are referred to as whereas clauses, and a couple of findings on pages 2 and 3, and the findings, the recitals and the findings really lay out the factual basis necessary to adopt an ordinance of this type. So, going to the first changes in the ordinance itself, from what you saw last time, I'm changing the and this was intended. But it's to make clear the definition of structured sober living home by way of the statute under which we're authorized to adopt this. It allows us to exclude from regulation those structured sober living homes that are otherwise regulated. So if they're licensed by the state, they're not licensed under this provision. If the home is controlled or if the standards are set by way of a contract with another government like the county or the state, like a parolee home or a probation type home, then those standards in the contract with the other government are what controls, and this ordinance would not apply to those. So I think that addresses some of the concerns that were raised last time, and that was the intent all along. One deletion, and that's probably a little hard to read, but there was a provision in there that required, as part of the application, an affidavit from the owner or operator attesting that the residents met non-discriminatory health and safety codes. Because these are residents and the county health department doesn't provide any type of oversight or regulation to these, that's really an unnecessary affidavit, because what they would be swearing to is really nothing, because there aren't any other kind of health safety codes that would apply. And then if there are other city code issues like zoning or other building code type requirements, that's already a requirement as part of a different section, so we're omitting that. Did a little bit of cleanup as well, and this is sort of a question for the council. There was an issue on the requirement regarding prior convictions. Originally, this Section 4 you see up there provided any owner, operator, or house manager. This draft now deletes the obligation or the requirement on house managers and simply applies it to owners and operators. Later on, when we get to the house manager section, I'll show you another change that I think probably more appropriately deals with the issue of prior convictions and whether someone's on supervised probation or parole. But the point of this is that even though the house manager is sort of the first, for lack of a better term, the first line of defense or the first line of offense for supervising the client residence, ultimately the burden or the onus is on the owner-operator. So we want to make sure that the owner-operator is, has the sort of highest, meets the highest standards, and not apply that to the house manager, who is even though again is sort of the on the boots on the ground type person, is really sort of low on the totem pole in these organizations. And so we'll get to kind of later on some of the house manager requirements. But this is a sort of if council wants to discuss this now or give me direction at the end. But in this particular cleanup, we've deleted the reference to staff person, because again, we're looking at the owner operators being the primary responsible party for meeting these obligations.
John, moving up the top of that page, number 2, did you intend to also include "or any staff person" in that paragraph on page 7?
Actually, that's never included, that number 2, which starts at the bottom of the page. Owner operator has an employment history, so that didn't include staff person in the past. That talks about the owner operator's employment history.
Okay.
Not necessarily the staff person. And again, the owner-operator sets the tone for the type of employment that goes on there, rather than, a relatively low level. If you're talking about house manager, you're talking about relative in sort of the organization. That's sort of one of the lower people on the totem pole, even though a very critical position for making sure that these standards are met. Ultimately, the burden, like I said, is really appropriately needs to be on the owner operator of the organization or of the entity. Another deletion, which again I think was a little difficult to enforce, is this mechanisms to use and to monitor to inform program management, quality, and improvement. In other words, the intent of that was that the owner-operator really needs to sort of have a program of continuous improvement, but the challenge is that it becomes a very difficult thing to monitor and to oversee as the city. And I don't think it was necessary to include that provision in the ordinance to achieve what we're trying to achieve. In this provision, we're dealing now with some of the regulatory requirements and operating rules that the operator has to develop. And this item 2, see if I can zoom in. Here we go. Okay. So in item 2, we cleaned it up a little bit, clarified that the preference is a 24-hour awake house manager, but the operator has alternatives or alternate. If the operator uses alternate means like bed checks, technological means, alarms, monitoring devices, that's an acceptable alternative to a 24-hour awake house manager. And we do that for sort of we do this for 2 reasons. One is sort of the practical application. We've talked about this before. It's nearly impossible to enforce a 24-hour awake house manager. We just don't have the ability to go into the home and do that. So we want to be able to when we're imposing these types of regulations, we want to make them enforceable. We don't want to just sort of adopt something theoretical. And by doing this, the operator then sort of gets to decide what's the best method or means to achieve the end result, which is to monitor residents who are either in distress or attempting to exit the structured sober living home during the curfew period. The other one is a sort of a legal requirement, as we've talked about. We're required to achieve this substantial government interest in the least restrictive means possible. So if we can achieve those things by means other than a 24-hour awake house manager, then the law requires us to allow for those less restrictive means to be put in place.
Councilwoman Orr.
Yes, John, I just think this 24/7 is such a critical part of these standards. And I know I've brought this up several times. There are some places that do it now. They have a 24/7.
Right.
And I think we need someone there awake.
Well, again, this allows for that as the preferred method. And some operators do have 24/7 awake, but most don't. And we're looking at, and again, we're looking at what the goal is to achieve rather than the technique or the method of how you get there. So, if we're monitoring for residents either in distress or attempting to exit during the curfew, if the methods or means aren't effective, in other words, if we have an operator who doesn't have a 24-hour awake house manager and there is a regular or an ongoing problem or a substantial problem with monitoring that, then we can look at sort of requiring a step up in their process. But I think initially we
And how would we know that?
well, because if, for instance, if you have distress, meaning essentially potential overdose or some other illness, well, if we have someone who is discovered in the morning as having essentially dead or OD or having some severe illness that should have been discovered prior, then we know that their method or their manner wasn't sufficient. But again, there's no way, at the end of the day, there's no way to enforce this 24-hour awake requirement. We just don't have, first of all, we don't have the staffing. And second of all, we don't have the ability to get into the house. So essentially, it becomes, at best, a voluntary program at that point. But if we can offer alternatives or say you have to do something to monitor your resident clients, and you have a choice of techniques, then I think we actually are closer to what we're trying to do, which is the monitoring, not the method or manner of how you do that.
John, are we going to require that these houses tell us what kind of method they're using?
As part of the license application, these operating rules will be submitted. So they will tell us as part of their license submittal, include all of this information. So we will know that. So again, I think that and remember, this is I'm not going to call it a one-year trial, but we have a one-year forced relook at this. So I think in the meantime, if nothing else, as a matter of law, we have to use the least restrictive means necessary. And so if these technological tools or bed checks or something else works, then it works. If it turns out during the one-year review period that it's not working, then at least we have a factual basis or factual grounds to then restrict back what we're requiring they do. But right now we don't have any. Right now, we don't have any factual basis to say the only way to do this is 24-hour awake. So we can't justify it because we have no data or factual basis to justify it. After a year, we may or may not.
Okay.
Another couple of changes, or for clarity purposes, we talked about the meals issue. Now, part of what the council will see during the adoption meeting of this ordinance is an amendment to the Land Development Code that I think I showed you last week that changes the definition of community residence. In order to be community residence, there has to be a meal protocol at least. And so in other words, in order to qualify as a community residence and be allowed in a residential zone, there'll have to be some meal provision process. We also included in this definition the operational standards. We took out the number of meals because, again, it becomes just a practical enforcement issue. But in deleting the 3 meals a day, also changed that, whatever your program is for feeding your client residences, public, social, or charitable service provided meals can't be part of that plan. In other words, if you're going to reap the benefits of the Fair Housing Act, which means you emulate a family, then, sending your family members off to a public, social, or charitable service provided type meal as a regular part of the plan is not going to get you that benefit, because that doesn't emulate a sort of traditional, typical family in a residential zone. So, and again, I think this should address the problem. It's not, and as I talked about before, we've talked about with a number of people, no, this law, this ordinance is not a 100% solution to every single problem that's out there. But we try and make it as broad as possible to deal with as many problems as possible. But I want to make sure that nobody has the illusion that this is the cure-all, end-all to every single problem out there, because this is the first time anybody's ever done this. And there's not a single government regulation or law that solves every single problem every time one comes up. So there are going to be issues, but I think this gets us where we want to go as far as dealing with this meals issue. And the other one in item 6 deals with the locking out question that came up. Again, part of the operating rules of the operator are going to be what's your protocol, what's your process to allow access to the residents by the residents during the day. So in other words, part of what they submit will be here's our program, here's our plan, and again, the basis for that is this last sentence we added, that part of maintaining a family-like environment is enabling access to the home. In other words, to emulate a family, you don't lock out the family during the day, at least in the normal sense of the word. I guess depending on how bad your kids are, but it's a whole nother story. So, the next change we make is dealing with the house manager. This is a new ad that part of the requirements for house manager, as we talked about before, high school diploma, GED, 21 years old, not on formal probation, supervision, or parole. So in other words, what this says is if your house manager is on formal probation, supervision, that's the highest level of probation. If it's unsupervised, that's sort of a low level probation. That doesn't preclude someone from being a house manager or on parole. So this sort of sets that standard of we want to try and achieve for house managers the highest standard of background and character that we can. It also requires, as before, 1 year sobriety as of the date of employment. I know that there are concerns from some of the folks in the industry about that these requirements may be too stringent, but remember, and I'll sort of briefly touch on it, and you see it, we have a reasonable accommodation process that an operator can go through to get some exceptions to these standards, and it becomes the the burden is on the owner-operator to show that the accommodation is reasonable and necessary to achieve whatever they're trying to achieve. So in other words, if someone is 9-10 months of sobriety, and the owner-operator can come in and say, this guy, this house manager has this training and this and it's clean, and can come in, there is a process for getting an exception to the rule. And that's necessary or required, I should say, by both Fair Housing Act and ADA. So we have to have a process, but at the same time, we have to set sort of clear-cut standards. Otherwise, it's just sort of a big gray area and nobody knows what applies. So we're setting standards, but there is a way to achieve a reasonable exception, a reasonable necessary combination to the rule. So hopefully that kind of, assuages people's concern about some of the requirements. Again,
John, I noticed
yes.
you don't have a definition of house manager. I think we need one. Maybe it may seem obvious to us all at this point in time, but we have a definition for owner, operator,
Okay.
but house manager definition would be helpful.
Sure. Okay. And then beyond those particular changes, council you have it in front of you, a whole process for reasonable accommodation. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through that, but it's a fairly standard process. It's done at a staff level, and the advantage of the requirement obviously is we have to have a reasonable accommodation process. The advantage of it is that if as someone comes in and requests a reasonable accommodation, and let's say that accommodation is granted, we have that documented in our files for that particular operator. So, if a problem arises as a result of the reasonable accommodation, then we can go back and essentially undo either that reasonable accommodation if it doesn't achieve the goal, or we can deny, future similar requests of that operator if the history bears out that reasonable accommodation doesn't achieve the intended goal. And last but not least, subject to your questions, is this section 5. It's talked about before, within a year of the effective date. So again, sometime in 2017, the council is going to require itself to have a relook at this, to have another public hearing, to look at how it's working, what's not working, and then you have the sort of decision-making ability to make necessary and appropriate changes. And I think that's important here because, again, this is frankly, it's somewhat of an experiment. Nobody's ever done this before, and so I think it's important to take a relook in that year to see how things are working and make necessary changes. Now, I will say that if in 6 months council wants to, have a look at it, that's perfectly fine. It's just there's no more than a year out. So anytime within 2017, council, once it's been implemented and we see how things are working, we have another sort of relook at and actually what the results are, what the data shows, what the facts are, and then when we make changes, if we want to restrict or ratchet back some of the requirements, we'll have a factual basis to do that, and then it becomes more legally defensible. So subject to your questions, I was brief.
Councilwoman Orr.
So John, on the violations and penalties, it talks about this is cumulative, and minimum civil sanction of not less than $100, a maximum. But every time there's a violation, it will be reported, recorded.
Potentially.
So
Right.
will there be opportunity for us to have kind of ongoing reports, not just at the end of the year, or 6 months?
No, right. And we could certainly do that. And that provision is not unique to this ordinance, but let me just kind of discuss it. is that this ordinance has certain enforcement tools to it. One is revocation of the license. Without the license, the operator can't operate. So that's a pretty heavy hammer as far as an enforcement tool. But there are lesser enforcement mechanisms, civil citations, criminal citations. And when we say cumulative, we mean that if someone violates this ordinance, let's say, I'll give you like a worst case example. One of the house managers or owner operators actually distributes drugs to a resident. Well, you've got a violation of this ordinance, but you also have a violation more than likely of many other laws, whether federal or state or local laws. And so if someone violates a law, it can, does something, it can violate many different laws, and all those can be charged. That's what the cumulative term means in that. So for minor infractions, we look at, our standard course of operation for code enforcement is compliance. So for minor infractions, code enforcement seeks compliance correction. If there's continued violations of that similar code issue or other code issues, then it can escalate to a civil infraction or civil citation, or to a criminal citation, or to a revocation of the license. So the cumulative is sort of horizontal. If you break a law, or if you do something, it can break many different laws. And then the enforcement sort of vertical. And, like anything, we sort of go through a gradual sort of enforcement, but sometimes you have to jump right to the heaviest handed if there's a real serious violation. But as a practice, as far as code enforcement, they tend to seek compliance and correction. And I think our code enforcement's done a really good job in that so far, and I expect that we'll continue with this.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you. Mark, on here it says, as far as financial impact, it says the ordinance contemplates a one-time fee charged for the license application, review, and issuance process. Do we have a fee schedule on that? Do we have a ballpark?
I have not.
We don't.
I'm not aware of one being established yet.
I think that's sort of maybe part two. If this is adopted, if I get direction, we'll bring it back to the next council meeting, October 11. If it gets adopted, the anticipated effective date is January 1. So between October 11 and January 1, we will develop a fee that is intended to cover the cost of the application review. It's more than likely, well, I can say this in fairness, it's more than likely going to be more than the business license fee.
Well, that's what I was hoping.
But I don't know where the top end is. Maybe less than the liquor license fee. I don't know. Just kidding. But I think we have, because we've had this discussion at a staff level. The application process is interdepartmental. Be many different departments involved in reviewing these applications. PD, code enforcement, finance, legal, community development, perhaps. I mean, so it's going to take sort of a lot of different sets of eyes to look at the applications to make sure it complies with the ordinance. So the intent of administrative fees is to try and be cost recovery. But part of it is an educated guess as to what it costs to do something.
Okay, so
and by doing it by resolution, too, it's a little easier to amend. So if we discover that it's too high or too low, we can come back to the council in 6 months and say we recommend that we raise the application fee by 15% because it's not covering our costs or something, or reduce it.
Okay, so just a part of it will be the business license fee.
Business license fee will be separate.
It'll be separate.
Be separate. The owner-operator will have to obtain a business license as well, and that's why the January 1st date is recommended as an effective date, because they kind of dovetail together.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments from the council? Okay, before we go to the public, I think Noel Campbell had a couple comments he'd like to give us.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and City Council, for letting me address you. I'm here today to implore you to pass an ordinance that requires 24/7 awake house managers. And I'm going to give you the reasons that I think why this is necessary. You know, as you're aware, my first attempt at regulation of structured sober living homes failed in the Senate, but passed in the House. But next year we came back with a new approach, and that was raising the standard of care in these homes. And that's a very important idea, and I'll come back to the high standards of care that we want to have in these homes. Before the next session, President Biggs granted me an ad hoc committee where we could learn and educate legislators about the entire recovery home industry in Prescott and in Arizona. Stakeholders from across the state were represented on this committee. Residents from Prescott came down to the Capitol and testified as to the horrors that they experienced. We learned of a woman who found someone overdosing underneath the deck of her home. A couple told us they lived in fear because of the loud verbal fights at all hours of the night. Another couple whose home was burned to the ground when they rented it to a recovery home operator. And worst of all, we learned of a couple who lost their son when the house manager sent him to bed because he thought he had stomach virus. And when that young man went to bed, he died and choked on his own vomit during the night, and they found him the next morning. Mayor Olberg's ad hoc committee also brought information to the public light. A young man testified that he could leave their homes, the structured living home, in the middle of the night, drive to Phoenix to purchase drugs, and come back to that same house to use them. He also said others just left the home and bought drugs in Prescott. I worked as hard as I could to pass House Bill 2107 to give you the authority to do something about this problem which has affected Prescott for years. You have a record here showing why you need awake 24/7 staff. You need to take the advantage of the authority that the state of Arizona has given you. I understand that there could be an option in the ordinance to have bed checks or place an alarm on the doors of these homes. That is not sufficient. Based on a vulnerable population, very new in recovery, we owe it to them to give them the best of care. And we also owe it to the residents of Prescott who care about their safety and welfare as well. Now, just as a side note, these young men are tech savvy, and they can easily disarm any alarm that's put in place if they want to. Heck, some of them probably would just do it because they can. And bed checks aren't sufficient. Too much can happen between a bed check. Spot checks could be done by a police officer going to the house and ringing the doorbell to see if the wake party comes to the door, or maybe the code enforcement. Random checks. That's the most effective way to make sure that that house is providing the highest standard of care for those young people. Let's face it, they're vulnerable. They're drug abusers. That's why they're in these homes. Their parents have sent them here because they are in fear for these young people. And we need to do everything to ensure that none of them slip through the cracks. And I'm afraid without a 24/7 full-time house manager, that some of them will slip through the cracks. And we've already had that happen. And so I really think if you're serious about protecting the health and safety and welfare of the residents of Prescott, as well as this vulnerable population inside of these homes, it can only be accomplished truly with the 24/7 awake staff. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Question or comments?
Other than I appreciate you speaking, Representative Campbell, because, you know, my career was as a principal. I can't imagine having somebody in my care for 24 hours and someone not be awake with them for 24 hours at some point in time. So I think it's absolutely essential. And I understand John's position on this, but I think I understand from some operators that have spoken, they said, you know, that would be really expensive. And so then you just the price of doing business.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else from the public like to speak? Come on down.
Hi, Mary Beth Wren. I'm also here to advocate for 24/7. Representative Campbell gave you, I believe, the evidentiary record for the reason for 24/7. But I'd like to talk to you about the term least restrictive means. And what it comes and what it means for this ordinance, at least what I think. You've been given the options for other than a 24/7 awake staff. You have in place in this ordinance some standards already. For the house manager, you have an age 21. Well, you can already reduce it to age 18. Or you have standards for training, CPR, conflict resolution, disease model of addiction. You can reduce that to just CPR. For the owner, you have 2 years of sobriety. You can reduce it to 1 year. So every standard you already have in place, you can already reduce it. So least restrictive means we can always reduce. You can water anything down that you already have in place. But the second point I want to really speak to, and you'll have to forgive me if I get a little too technical, but I kind of do want to bring in the constitutional law a little bit. And I won't have whiteboards or different color markers, but when the government passes a law, and this kind of has to do with the fear of being sued over this, and it's really the potential, and I really hope we're not too risk averse, because as what John's talked about, this is the first time out of the box here, and I think we really can do the right thing. So when we pass a law, what a judge is going to look at is what kind of law did you pass. So if we're going to pass a law affecting like free speech or your privacy rights or anything affects race, your right to vote, that's what triggers like strict scrutiny. Okay, and that's where you get this least restrictive means, because the government has to have a compelling interest in order to pass that law. So that's what he means by you, in order to pass that law and you have these requirements, you have to do it in the least restrictive means. But if you pass a law going down and say it only has to do with gender, then it triggers like an intermediate scrutiny. So the government, it just has to have an important government interest. And as you go further down, and the government law only has to do with, say, dealing with a handicap or economic or social welfare issues, then it's considered a rational basis test. And then the government just has to have any compelling reason to do this. And it's not the least restrictive means. So I believe that the first time out of the box, given the evidentiary record that Representative Campbell has put out through all of the neighbors that have testified down as ad hoc committee and through Mayor Oberg's ad hoc committee, I don't believe this is going to trigger a strict scrutiny test, because we're regulating social and welfare issues, not only for the residents in these homes, but also for the residents, the health, safety, and welfare of the residents here in Prescott. And that's why I really do believe you can put a 24/7 awake staff here, because you really do have to balance this. I mean, we've had the industry testify that they have a 24/7 awake staff and the kids are still getting out. So if we really need, and we're serious about protecting both the residents and the clients, I don't see how you can do anything less. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Mayor and council, thanks for having me up here. And I'm about the same thing.
Could you give your name and...
my name is Louis Gomez, and I own Prescott Tire Pros and Auto Service. I'm a recovering drug addict of 15 years. And a local business owner, I pay taxes. And I love this. I really, really, really love this. You know, there's a couple things I have issues with, which isn't bad. The one thing I think is, because this is at least a high school diploma. My father had a 6th grade education. My uncle had a 6th grade education, multimillionaires. You know, there's a lot of people in this world. You know, my dad went through the Depression, a lot of times like that. There's kids now that don't have high school diplomas. I have one working for me now. He's smart as a whip, you know. So that's one thing. The other thing is this 24-hour thing. I went through a halfway house called The Bridge. I graduated from there in 2003. We had 24-hour supervision. There was only 5 halfway houses back then. We policed our own. If you can't afford to have somebody on staff to take care of them 24 hours a day, you don't need to be in business. You need to figure out how to do it. I went to the halfway house. When I was going back there, it was $550 a month. How many people do you have in these houses? Quite a few. If you can't afford to have somebody on staff at night, then you don't know how to run a business. That's just what it is. It works pretty good. How our house did it was, there was a person that came at night that slept during the day, came in at night, and he just overseen it. If somebody tried to get out at night, well, it wasn't going to happen. Then you wake somebody up and you make the adjustments you have to. You can call the police or do whatever you want. You know what I mean? I just think we really have to have 24-hour supervision. I think this is wonderful. I'm pretty sure that's pretty much what I had, but for the safety of the people, when people see this, the regular Joes out there, people don't know I'm in recovery. They have no idea. I tell people all the time, they get surprised, But anybody can be in recovery, but we need to make our citizens safe. When we're walking downtown, like I did just 2 weeks ago, and some kid came to me with a can and says, "Hey, I need money to pay my halfway house bill." It's like, no, you need to take that jar and get out of town. You know what I mean? I really like the part when if somebody in the halfway house gets if you're thrown out of the halfway house for whatever reason it is, there's got to be a place for that person to go. The people need to realize that. Whether it's the police department, well, it's going to probation, they take them to jail. Whatever it may be, that person needs to go somewhere. You know what I mean? We just need to, what you're doing here is phenomenal. What I see it is phenomenal, and I think what the people really need to read this too, but I think 24 hours is a necessity. We have to have that. So that's pretty much all I have.
Okay, thank you. Now, as far as when he was talking about the GED, that goes back to the reasonable accommodation where we'll have somebody take a look and possibly there could be some.
Right. The requirement is a high school diploma or GED equivalent. But again, because of the reasonable accommodation process that's included in the ordinance, there is an ability to get an exception to the rule. At the same time, like I said, I think there needs to be in that instance some standard. I mean, as far as what the desired goal or measurement is, and then you can create exceptions or accommodations from that desired goal or standard.
So basically, we see it being more rare than something of a normal practice.
Right, it's an exception to the rule. Reasonable accommodation is basically an exception to the rule, and it's a case by case decision based on the request that's necessary and reasonable is how it boils down for those. And so, I mean, ultimately it's sort of a council policy decision, but part of if you look at part of the training requirement for house managers, I mean, it is. Somewhat of an it's brief and it's specific, but it's somewhat of an elevated type, learning requirement. So, but ultimately, there is an exception to the rule available.
Okay.
Mayor, could I
go ahead.
say something? What kind of liability do we have if we say, okay, 24/7, and then we don't enforce it, or we're not able to enforce it?
Well, I guess I can address that. With all due respect, Mary Beth, the analysis under Fair Housing Act and ADA is essentially what's called a strict scrutiny. Achieving a substantial government interest in the least restrictive means possible. I think the problem that by going to a 24/7 awake staff was just raised or just sort of acknowledged is that doesn't necessarily work. So, in other words, if residents are still getting out of the house or still, being able to use in the house with a 24-hour awake type requirement, then that's not necessarily the answer. In other words, the whole idea is 24-hour monitoring of the resident to deal with either leaving the house during the curfew or doing something in the house that creates either a medical or some other problem in the house. And so, we don't, again, I disagree. We just don't have the factual. In fact, we don't have the factual basis to say that 24-hour, awake staff is the only answer. In fact, just the opposite was stated, that with 24-hour awake staff, people still do things that they're not supposed to do. So, in this day and age of technology and other capabilities, I think what we need to do is look at, in this 1 year, look at what works and what doesn't work, and then refine later. I think if we go too far, we do get the chance of being sued, and it's not a matter of being risk averse or being afraid of being sued. It's a matter of doing something that's legally defensible and that's effective, and that you get you get industry buy-in, because at the end of the day, like every other law that's out there, most compliance is voluntary. Whether it's paying your taxes or driving the speed limit or not doing something illegal, I mean, there's the fear of getting caught, but at the end of the day, it becomes voluntary. And I don't know, I would defer to the police chief whether or not she wants to send her officers or code enforcement around in the middle of the night to do bed checks. Or
if I could, Chief Black, could you address this somewhat? Do you have the ability to enforce a 24/7?
With our current staffing levels, I'd say that would be very challenging. One of the aspects that Mr. Palladini had talked about before was kind of a self-regulation or either residents of the homes or previous residents of the homes providing information. So in a targeted way, if we had information through a tip line or something like that they were not staffing it appropriately, yeah, we could probably manage that based on demand and calls for service. As a matter of course, no.
And let me just throw this in, as the chief made a point. There is that provision in it, basically is that whistleblower protection type provision, that not just for the employee, but for the residents as well, that says that the owner-operator can't sort of take adverse action if there's a legitimate report of an owner-operator or somebody violating the rules. And so, I think, creating some sort of tip line, whether it's a dedicated line, short of a 911 call, and also remember that the ordinance allows for the office, requires the owner, operator, or house manager to allow a police officer in based, sort of, it's a pre-agreed to voluntary or waiver, I guess, where the police officer can go in if there's probable cause to believe that there is a violation of this ordinance or any other law into the common area of the home. So short of the bedrooms, the police officer can go in without a warrant because the owner-operator is agreeing ahead of time to allow the officer in based on a probable cause. So if there is a call that somebody is doing something in violation of this ordinance or something else, the officer or code enforcement, during the day or night, it is allowed to enter the home without having to get a warrant, and that's part of the application process. So, there are, enforcement is going to be sort of as applied when if there is an allegation of wrongdoing, and I mean that's normally the way that law enforcement works. I mean, to have this sort of preemptive kind of bed checking. I mean, that's not really practical.
Thank you, and thank you, Chief.
Councilman Blair?
Yeah, I find it interesting that I don't want to be too critical about this, but any law that we have on the books is it's on your honor anyway. I mean, you know how many drinks you can have before technically you've had too many. You know how fast you're supposed to drive based upon the speed limit, but how many drive over the speed limit. So when it comes down to it, you need to have some kind of guidelines, and this truly is a guideline. And the guidelines should be strong enough to, I guess, say, put the fear in the operators. And when you start talking about 24/7, I agree with that 100%. And the reason why I do is no matter how you look at it, when my teenagers were growing up, I would say there was more fear and more likelihood they wouldn't sneak out of the house if they thought I was going to be awake. So if you have managers that are in that house that are supposed to be doing their job 24/7, there's less of an opportunity to have a problem. on that side. And I think we owe that to recovery, and I think we owe it to our community to have 24/7.
Any other from the public?
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor, Council. With regards to 24/7, yes, people can do things, even with people awake watching them. When I was going through my psych affiliation, we had people on suicide watches that would still manage to try in a psych hospital. But if you've got somebody awake and watching them, monitoring them, they're more apt to catch them before it becomes fatal than if they're just asleep somewhere. Any kind of healthcare facility, you've got somebody awake 24 hours of the day. And this is a healthcare facility, whether you like it or not. They need to be awake. They need to be watched. Monitors on the windows, technical things, that's great. Go for it. Put them in there as an extra precaution to keep people from sneaking out. But they can be bypassed, like Mr. Palladini said. They can do that. They know how to do that. They know better than most of us do. So 24 hours and 7 days a week, they need to be watched and they need to be monitored, because you're less likely, as Mr. Blair said, to have problems if they think you're awake than if you're asleep. Also, some people are very heavy sleepers and wouldn't hear a bomb dropped on them, which is another problem. And that's just a fact of life also. And as regards to nutrition, nutrition is a strong part of recovery, especially for alcoholics and drug addicts, because their nutrition is very poor during the process of their disease. So they need food, they need proper nutrition. So that really needs to be part of it. They need to have some kind of plan where they have meals available that they can eat that are nutritious meals. And unfortunately, most of the charitable things, they're just food. They're not necessarily nutritious meals. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Hello, I'm Asher Kaufman. Thank you for having me today. And thank you for welcoming me into Prescott as a young man in recovery. I work at a house. I am a house manager. And I see the 24-hour supervision as a good idea. Don't get me wrong, but I see it as a Band-Aid on what the real problem is. The real problem is the lack of structure, the lack of guidance for these young men and women. And what I see as the solution, as someone who just went through the house manager training at Yavapai, is that a lot of these young house managers don't have direction at how they should do their job. So instead, how I see it, instead of being, okay, we need to be protective and have more supervision on these kids, how about on the other end of the spectrum that we give the house managers the tools they need to do their jobs and to help these young people. So my suggestion would be, and I know I'm not a city councilman, but would to be to make that house managing training class mandatory for all house managers and see how that goes. Thank you for letting me share.
So are you saying you think that the current course that's out there needs to be upgraded and have more instruction?
I think everyone needs to do it, because there's CPR, there's naloxone training, there's crisis prevention. There's different, you're able to build a community within the house managers to share your experience, strength, and hope with them. So no, I don't. I think it is perfect as is. I just think everyone needs to do it.
Okay. Councilwoman Wilcox.
John, under the section 4-6-8, certification of house manager, is it required that a house manager enroll in a course approved by the city of Prescott and then do that recertification annually?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah,
that should address that.
Okay.
Yeah, the prior section, I'm sorry, the following section 469 sets out the minimum course requirement. We don't endorse a particular course. To the extent, I mean, let's say one of the industry associations wants to, develop their own course at little to no cost to those operators belonging to the association. That's fine, but we get sort of a first look at that to make sure it at least meets the standards that we're looking at, that whether it's Yavapai College, whether it's a private provider, for profit, or whether it's the industry, some industry group. We're not picking and choosing a particular course, just a course, and obviously courses need to meet the minimum qualifications, and we take a look at that. We would take a look at that, prior to implementation of the course by someone else, say. So it's in there.
Okay.
If I may say one thing, that as a house manager, if my client wants to leave in the middle of the night, I've failed somewhere. So instead of trying to patch me up after I've already been wounded, what I try to do is as much prevention and as much teaching and as much guidance as I can before it gets to that point. Thank you for your time, guys.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Asher.
Yep. Mayor Pro Tem?
Thank you. As we sit here again, going over some of this, there's, in my mind, no argument that people that are in either alcohol or drug rehabilitation are emotionally, physically, medically, mentally disabled. That's why they're a protected class. I just listened to Asher. I'm not going to compare Asher to a baby, but you would no more leave a baby unsupervised who's a disabled, incapable person of taking care of themselves than you would somebody who falls into the classification of mentally, emotionally, physically, medically disabled 24/7. That's why they're here. Whether it's with Alzheimer's, whether it's with some other malady of some sort, when you have disabled people, they are disabled. And I really think if we're going to take on the role of designing a city ordinance with a concept of serving not only our local residents, public health and safety, but those of the folks that have come here to be not only rehabilitated but reintroduced to society as a whole, you need to give it 100% effort, not a, shot in the dark type situation. John and I have had conversation where we don't necessarily agree on the definition of disabled, but people whose brains have been altered because of drug and alcohol abuse are disabled people. And they need something different than just treating them as though, or subjecting them to treatments as though they had some other sort of a disability. Their disability is not the same. Drug and alcohol rehabilitation is not the same as trying to learn to walk again because you were crippled. They're different things. You're talking about a mental disability, a physical disability, emotional disability, and things that have been done with mind-altering substances, and we need to take that in mind 24/7, not sometimes.
Mayor, I can sort of sense where this is going. Let me offer maybe a compromise. In section, in that section that deals with the operating rules 4, 6, 7, 2, after the first sentence where it says, where it ends, President in awake at the structured sober living home, 24/7. If we inserted the language as a reasonable accommodation in lieu of an awake house manager 24 hours a day, the structures, in other words, we acknowledge that rather than make it an automatic exception to 24/7, we make it a reasonable accommodation so someone goes through the process. Because again, I just don't, I'm not, from a legal defensibility standpoint, having that as having a awake 24/7 is going to be very, very difficult to enforce, and 2, to defend if someone were to challenge it as not the least restrictive means. So rather than make it an automatic exception, as the current language is, if we added language as a reasonable accommodation, which means they go through the process, an operator goes through the process to request the exception to the rule, then we have it documented, and then we can measure it to see if those alternative means are effective or not. I think that's, I think it's a fair compromise, I guess, but from a defensibility standpoint, to make the 24/7 the only method or means, I think is potentially troubling.
Councilman Shishka.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Could the young man who was up here, could you come back up? It's good to have you here. Thank you. I'd like to know a little bit about the structure of the home that you're in.
Okay.
Okay. Are you the only house manager in the home?
No, I work 3.5 days, and then my coworker works 3.5 days.
Okay. Okay. And how reasonable would it be for you to be up 24/7? Or 24, 3.5, I guess.
There would have to be a third house manager. There'd have to be someone that worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. Because I do a lot during the day. To be honest, I'm driving guys around. I'm taking care of stuff for my boss. I'm seeing that they get where they need to go.
Okay.
So I could not do it, no. There'd have to be another full-time guy. Of course.
Okay. All right. That's all I needed to know. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
Hey, John, under the ADA, is financial hardship a reason to
Yes.
grant a reasonable
Under
accommodation?
both Fair Housing Act and ADA, financial hardship can be a basis for reasonable accommodation.
So if an operator comes in and requests an accommodation and says, I just can't afford to hire double my staff, so I have 24/7 awake, they could get a reasonable accommodation?
I will just say that's a legitimate basis for making the request. Whether they get it or not all depends on the reasonable and necessary and decision-making process that's set out in the code. But yes, as a matter of law, a financial reason can be a basis for requesting a reasonable accommodation. Yes.
Well, it seems to me then every operator who doesn't like this rule and who feels a financial pinch, is going to come in and ask for an accommodation and be able to get it.
Well,
so
whether
the
they
rule is meaningless.
Well, again, whether they get it or not is a case-by-case decision-making or analysis, and it's going to, if there's just saying I can't afford it, there has to be some factual basis or accounting or some sort of evidence to show that the financial burden is too great. So there has to be some basis for it, but again, the alternative, if it's either an automatic exception to the rule. Now we have operators who have 24/7 awake staff, and we have operators who don't. I think if and I will just say again, there is the least restrictive means to achieve this. The government interest is required under the Fair Housing Act and ADA. So we are stuck with that analysis, and like I said, we've already heard today that awake staff doesn't necessarily equate to solving the problem. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure, and I think the implication or the inference that those other means are actually less effective. We don't have any basis or facts to make that conclusion. In other words, are alarms more effective than somebody who's awake and watching TV across a 3,000 square foot house? So the factual basis for making decisions works both ways. We can conclude that an awake staff is preferred or the best method, but we don't have any factual basis to tell us that it is. I don't have anything, to defend that if we were to get challenged.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you again, not trying to or wanting to compare Asher to a baby, but here again, most mothers are not up 24/7. but they're available, and their kid is under their supervision. And sometimes moms have monitors, and sometimes mom do this. The awake point isn't my issue. The fact that somebody's vulnerable, just like a baby is, their mother's there, and if a baby cries, the mother wakes up. If the baby moves wrong, the mother wakes up. What they don't do is they don't leave the baby alone. And that's my point.
And again, just to be clear, we're talking about 24-hour presence in the home. We're not talking about an exception to that. It's the awake part that is the challenge. It's the and you know, like I said, it's the challenge for the enforcement part of it, as well as just the practical. You know, is it the best? Is it the only means to achieving this goal? That's the question for you all to address.
Councilman Blair.
I don't normally argue with attorneys because I'm sitting here listening to my advice as the counselor that you're giving us. But from my standpoint, I'd rather take the chance of being sued legitimately by the federal government on us trying to make something better in our community than not. And I agree with Lamerson 100%. The whole idea about these folks being in a home is because they have mental addiction and mental problems. And I think for one thought in my mind, I think we can defend that because I think it makes the situation better. Like you say, there's no proof to that, but I would take the opposite side of the coin and say I'd rather be on the side of saying we did it because we have an obligation than not doing it and have somebody die from it.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. John, I agree with you that there's a potential, possibly. But if we tried the first ordinance last couple of years ago, and we got the distance and everything, they came in and said you can't do that, challenged it, and we reduced the standard after that. And I think 24/7 awake, we put that standard high, and if it's challenged, and we can go from there. But you know, the first rule of management, you can't go in nice. You go in as a hard ass, and you can become nice later. You can't do it the other way around.
So I've heard from 5, so I think it should be in there.
All right, next, please.
My name is Peter Thomas. I'm a resident of Prescott. I'm also the executive director of Chapter 5. Thank you, Mayor and Council. It sounds like you've mostly come to a decision, but I want to reiterate support for 24-hour awake staff. 2 weeks ago I spoke and I said that at Chapter 5, with awake staff, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and monitoring on doors, people can still get out. But what I should have said and failed to say is all of the instances where that prevented something from happening, whether it be an overdose in the house, somebody coming back into the house with drugs, a behavioral outburst. In the current landscape of licensing at the state level, it's imperative that we have 24-hour awake staff. Chapter 5 is a licensed behavioral health residential facility, and there are standards for who we can and cannot admit. Those standards do not exist for structured sober living homes, and the structured sober living homes can admit a client that we would say is too acute for our care. As long as that's the case, I don't see any way around 24-hour awake staff. It's my hope that Noel Campbell will continue this momentum and reintroduce legislation at the state level that will further break out the levels of care, in which case the 24-hour awake staff would be based on the acuity of patients being served. That doesn't exist right now. As far as regulation and oversight, the state comes to Chapter 5 for each of our facilities one time a year, randomly during business hours. They're not doing random checks in the middle of the night, and I don't think that that's a requirement of the city. I think that gives us, the city, a way to go in and act if there is an overdose in the house, if somebody gets out and commits crime, or any number of instances happen. In lieu of that, if the housing fails to oversee their clients, as long as they have monitoring, the city doesn't have any recourse, and I think that is damaging to the efficacy of the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. I also wanted to add that with the 24/7, there can be an exception. There was a gentleman that spoke at the last meeting who it's all volunteer, and he's dealing with a whole set of different type of addict and alcoholics, and maybe that exception, because it is volunteer and he takes no money, that would be that exception that we could look at to waive that 24/7 awake. Also, if I have a parent or a grandparent in a home that, or a hospital that's being, because they're elderly or they're sick, I would rather somebody be awake, which these institutions make money to care after these people, and you expect that type of service.
Next.
Richard Steelman, Prescott. Hi, Mayor, Council. Steve, I'm with you. We need some definition for the legal responsibility here on the city side of this, which I would ask Mr. Palladini. 24/7, isn't the burden on the owner-operator to keep these people safe 24/7?
Well, like I said before, this is a regulation that imposes certain minimum standards. Part of the standards are, what the city sets out in the code, and part of the standards are what the owner-operator includes in his or her operating standards, which are incorporated into the code. So a violation of the operating standards are ultimately a violation of the code. So ultimately, like I said before, the burden for compliance with this is on the owner-operator, not necessarily the house manager, who's merely an employee of that operation. So yeah, the burden is always on the owner-operator as far as liability goes. Whether we require 24/7 awake staff or provide for some alternative means to achieve the same goal, it doesn't increase or decrease the liability. It simply is a function of enforceability.
Yeah. What my thought was, should we include some kind of definition for the owner-operator of the business? Because this is a business, and I already feel like I'm subsidizing this business because of the EMT services we provide, the police services we provide. So the taxpayers are already on the hook to run this industry in our city. We don't recoup nothing back from this. And I don't want to see the city being me. I don't want to get sued because we didn't have the language in there on who's accountable, responsible, and so on and so forth for living lives, people. You can't, they're supposed to be in a family-like living environment 24/7, not 16 hours a day, not 20 hours, all day, all night. And it's the technology thing comes in too. The gas company can drive down my street with this truck and tell me if I got a gas leak in my house. The city drives down my street and they can read my water meter. They don't have to ring my doorbell, talk to me or nothing. These people, why can't they have some kind of a little membership thing attached to them that says, I'm home where I'm supposed to be and I'm okay? You buy it, you put it on your wrist, and it might save your life. Is it worth it? You decide. So that's my thought on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Okay, how are you going to rewrite that part on the 24/7?
How do you want me to rewrite it?
24/7.
Well, I'm getting the general consensus from the group here that 24/7 is what they're looking for.
Okay.
But at the same time, I can see that there could be a need for a reasonable accommodation. But again, I would think that there would be a limit on that. Like, in 90 days, you have to be in compliance. You have to find a way to be in compliance within a certain amount of time.
And again, reasonable accommodations are case-by-case, fact-based decision-making. They can have, in some instances, time restrictions or limitations, depending on how long the accommodation is needed for. In other words, if somebody has a temporary disability at work, they get a reasonable accommodation, for that sort of temporary time period. So in this instance, in theory, there is an opportunity to set a time limit, but unless it's without having the specific facts, all we're talking about is hypotheticals. So, that every reasonable combination is going to be case by case, and to the extent that there's time limits, there may be time limits, but we would have to just address that on a case by case basis.
So could you say something like 24/7, but that reasonable accommodation would be made for a temporary limitation?
Well, I think that's sort of inherent in a reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
For instance, on the house manager requirement of 1 year of sobriety, if they come in, if the owner operator comes in and says, I've got a guy 10 months in who I want to be a house manager, that reasonable accommodation is really good for 2 months, because after that they meet the requirement. So it's kind of inherent sometimes, and sometimes they may be permanent. It's just going to depend on. I don't think we can sort of predetermine or pre-limit that the accommodation is going to be temporary in all instances. We just have to deal with it case by case.
Okay, so then therefore you can go ahead and say 24/7 period, and everybody knows that the reasonable accommodation is available to them.
There are reasonable accommodations, and like I said, we at this, and again, that's the sort of purpose of this 1 year, check mark of, we're going to have some data and some information and knowledge to then make whatever necessary changes we make, and we'll have that information available as a basis for, like I said, either ratcheting back some of the requirements or loosening the requirements up. At this point, we're first out of the box, so this is a little bit of this. This is, again, like I said, experimental. But we can try it and see what happens. But for most of the requirements, if an owner operator has a reasonable and necessary request for accommodation, the law requires us to work with that operator. Sometimes the operator doesn't get or the person requesting the accommodation doesn't necessarily get what they want, because it may not be reasonable, it may be beyond the scope. But they may get something middle ground, and maybe it's a time limit, maybe it's a different means or method to achieve that same goal.
Okay. At this point, I think, unless there's any more questions or comments from the council, I think you know what you need to do on to finalize the code for us to bring it for a vote.
On the 11th of October, we'll bring forward a final version, I hope, and as well as a separate ordinance which will amend the land development code definition of community residence dealing with the meals issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Great.
Next item, please.
Item B, presentation and discussion of a draft ordinance authorizing code enforcement to cite for all city ordinance infractions.
Mayor, Council, I wanted to bring this to a study session briefly to discuss some of the changes you have in front of you, an ordinance you have in front of you that make changes to the city code. First, the main change here is our current city code. Well, let me give you a little bit of history. Originally, a city code violation went before a hearing officer, and it was more a mediation than it was an adjudication of a violation. In other words, a hearing officer would hear a code violation, would sort of try and get the violator to comply, but the violations rarely went to a civil infraction, let alone a criminal infraction or criminal citation. Subsequent to that, we adjusted for the property maintenance code to be enforced by code enforcement. So code enforcement has the specific ability to cite into city court a violation of the property maintenance code. What this ordinance does is it expands that enforcement ability throughout the city code. So the code enforcement under this would have the ability to direct cite, civil cite, a code violation, whether it's a violation of this section we just talked about, whether it's a violation of the city's smoking in public places law, or those kinds of things. And what it does, I think what it does is, and this is working in conjunction with police department, is it actually it reduces the workload on the police officers on some of these more minor code issues, and it gives code enforcement the ability to direct cite for a civil violation into city court for a violation of city code. And again, I stress that a code enforcement's primary function is compliance and correction. But without having the tool of the ability to cite, without having that leverage, sometimes code enforcement can't get compliance or correction, at which point code enforcement can do one of two things. Can go to a police officer, have the police officer cite that person, or come to the city prosecutor's office and do what's called a long form, basically file a complaint in court. It's a little bit more of a cumbersome process. It involves more people. This change basically allows code enforcement to enforce city code by way of a civil citation, traffic ticket effectively, for a violation of city code when they can't get compliance and correction. So I think with the police chief, we recommend that this be changed in the code, because again, it's sort of the idea is to take workload off the police officers and the city prosecutor and delegate some of that ability, I guess, or that authority to code enforcement to take means necessary if they can't get compliance and correction. So I wanted to bring it to a study session first. See if there's any questions, issues, concerns, and if not, we'll bring it forward to our next meeting.
Councilman Blair?
I think it's great. It's way overdue. At this point, Mr. City Manager, how many code enforcement officers do we have?
We currently have one code enforcement officer.
Okay, that in fact is my concern, that even though we're taking some heat off of our police department, we're piling up on our one code enforcement officer. So the question would be for this council during the budgeting process is to look at putting in place a couple of more code enforcement officers, and also to explore through the police department and the legal department how we can better utilize volunteers and their ability to be volunteers underneath the guidelines of Mike being their supervisor, to go out and do some of these inspections on weeds and those types of things, to be his eyes and ears so that he can better function out there doing his job, whether it be removing signs in the right-of-way that are illegally placed. It would seem to me that we could use a volunteer staff force authorized by Mike being the head of code enforcement to lighten that load until the council makes a decision on a couple of new employees.
And I think to sort of distinguish, I know that we've looked at like volunteers and we're able to issue parking tickets, which state law doesn't allow us to do. However, in this ordinance draft, it specifically provides that the city manager has the authority to appoint code enforcement officers. It doesn't limit it to employees, so in theory it could be a volunteer. We would want to make sort of a good vetting of any volunteer who were to do that. But it also allows the city manager to designate existing employees as having code enforcement authority. So for instance, the building safety supervisor or the building safety person could have specific designated authority to issue citations for, say, violations of the building code. Same with the fire marshal could have specific delegation to cite for violations of the fire code, sort of their subject matter expertise in those areas, rather than have to go to the currently one code enforcement guy. It becomes at the same time, because otherwise right now it either has to go to the city prosecutor's office or police to cite for violations when we can't. And again, I stress this, and I want to stress this time and time again, compliance and correction is the main goal and function of code enforcement. It's not to ticket people right and left. And our history, I think, has proven that, and I just want to make sure that's stressed here.
Well, it sounds like a great avenue, because the more and more regulations and ordinances we write that have enforcement capabilities to them, it would seem now that you gave us a different avenue with the city manager being able to appoint a volunteer, and we have a lot of retired police officers here that would probably do great in that position. So I think we've found a way where we might be able to have some more folk.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you, Mayor. Councilman Blair's point, especially when we get to the budgetary process, it's all a matter of priorities as to how we spend the public's money. And health and safety has been one of my issues for a long time. And to the point of using retired personnel from either police or fire or military or whatever the case would be, you have a litany of people in the city of Prescott that have chosen to volunteer and will continue to volunteer on different things. It's a question of developing, and I know the fire department right now is developing a protocol for certain things. We already have enough codes. We already have enough laws. The issue is enforcement. You already have things on the books for fire safety. You do. And I know we have the ability to inspect, especially those places open to the public, on an annual basis. Now, whether or not that's a freebie or that's a service that gets charged for, that's out of the scope of what people's business licenses are being charged for, is a different issue. There are certain things that aren't just a given. Just my opinion on that. So anyway, I think enforcement and the use of volunteers can help.
Councilman Lozelle.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to reiterate what John was saying here, that this is, reading this, it's a 30-day compliance, a 30-day, correction. It's not a citation right away, because my concern, and no opinion, Mike, or no offense, I didn't want a bunch of brown shirt HOA people running around town trying to make us into Sedona. But there is some times that, and I know for a fact, things that have gone on and on and on, we're going, why aren't these people cited? Because we work with these people for over a year and they're still not complying. So this will put some teeth into it. As far as the volunteers, and I imagine the chief and Mike will vet these people properly, maybe at first that these volunteers give the order of correction instead of the citation. And then that isn't to an employee to do the citation itself.
And let me just clarify too, we've got a kind of a standing agreement with police and code enforcement that before, even for the current citation ability, that before any citation is issued by code enforcement for a code violation, because it's rarely an urgent matter, that they come and talk to us, in the city attorney's office, the prosecutor, to make sure that we have the proper basis to do it. Because we don't do it that often. In fact, it's rare where we actually cite someone for a code enforcement type violation. But we want to make sure that if we go and do this, that we do it right, that we do it properly, and that there is in fact a violation of the code that just simply isn't being corrected given whatever time. So we're not, I want to, or again, I'll say this time and time again, this is sort of the last resort to cite someone civilly or criminally for a code violation. With this, it is when you just can't get compliance. Somebody is just being a hardhead, and the only way sometimes to get enforcement is to cite someone. That oftentimes turns into a compliance tool.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
I agree with Councilman Blair that we can't continue to pile all these responsibilities on one code enforcement officer. We really need a couple or maybe several more positions. Maybe they could be part-time positions so that we could cover weekends more effectively. A lot of these things do happen on weekends. And suddenly they get corrected by Monday. The sign goes off the right of way or whatever. But we do need some weekend enforcement. Volunteers have some usefulness, but we have to remember they're volunteers. If they don't feel like showing up that day, they don't have to. There's no penalty other than they may get knocked off the list. So big deal. I really think it's important to have paid employees, either part-time or full-time, who are dedicated to the task. If we're asking Mike to be the supervisor of volunteers, we're piling one more responsibility on him. And so let's please consider in the budget process
expanding some of these positions.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions, comments?
Mayor, I'm somewhat confused. On the last issue, we were saying we need to put something in the ordinance to set a standard, but we know we can't enforce it. And now we're saying we absolutely need to enforce everything that we put in an ordinance. So I'm just confused from the standpoint of which is it?
Well, I don't know. You can hire a police officer to sit on every road in town and write a ticket for everybody that speeds, but you're still going to have people that do it and aren't caught. So but I think if there's an ordinance or a law in place and people break it and they're caught, they need to pay for it. Maybe that helps figure it out for you.
I'm not sure,
muddies the waters.
Mayor, I'm not sure what the specific reference is to, but code enforcement is 9 times out of 10 a complaint-based enforcement. In other words, it's not, code enforcement, one guy or 10 guys for that, 10 people for that matter, aren't necessarily driving around, patrolling, looking for code violations. It really, especially with the limited manpower we have now, even if you add a couple of part-time people or one more full-time person, you still don't have the ability. I mean, it is a call kind of operation. So in code enforcement, Mike or whomever goes from call to call to call based on a complaint, so 9 times out of 10, and takes a look. And if there is a code violation, and oftentimes it's a property maintenance issue or it's a something else going on, the main primary function, like I said, is getting compliance and correcting the problem. And like I said, the vast majority of the time that solves the problem. So we're not so I'm not sure what you're referring to in the group home ordinance about I guess my point in that is that when we adopt an ordinance or any type of law, often there is an element of voluntary compliance, and if it may be sort of a forced volunteerism for threat of being or for fear of being caught or for fear of being cited or something like that. But at the end of the day, you pay your taxes sort of voluntarily because you don't want the IRS coming down on you. I mean, there is an element of voluntarily doing something because of the fear of getting caught. So my point in the group home ordinance is that we don't have anywhere near the staffing to monitor. We aren't in the business of monitoring the internal operations of a particular group home. We talked about that before. That's the owner-operator responsibility, delegating down to staff, ultimately to the house manager. It's the same for any other code requirement, and that is that we seek voluntary compliance, say, with the property maintenance code. But if you fail to do it and a neighbor complains, we go out and we try and get compliance and correct the problem.
Chief Black?
Councilman Shishka, if I could just add maybe some clarification. I see this as an efficiency as opposed to an expansion of our current code enforcement department, which is one person.
Sure.
I'm not looking to add work on him, although the ordinance we just discussed would add to his duties, and any other ordinance that we add could fall to his responsibility. What really made this clear to me was when he discussed a case that it took 8 hours and to submit a long-form complaint, which then falls to Mr. Palladini's staff to do more work, where a citation could have been issued in a fraction of the time and had the same effect, probably a better effect.
Well, thank you, because in our strategic plan, we're talking about government efficiency, and it sounds like that's going to add to our government efficiency. So
Very
thank
much
you for
so.
clearing that up. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments from the council? Any from the public? Okay,
I yield the floor, Mr. Mayor.
fine.
Thank God.
Next item.
Item C, council discussion of rescinding the city liquor license fees.
Mayor, if I could just briefly go over some of the history. Dana, the city clerk, put together a history for the council, just to go through it for the benefit of the public who may not have seen it. In 1965, essentially the existing section of the code, Title IV, Chapter 7, was established to bring the city into compliance with state liquor law. That established all of our categories for different liquor licenses and the fees. In 81, we established a special event liquor license code. That was the next change to the liquor license. In 95, there were some more administrative changes that were done to the code. In 2003, we adopted new rates, increased rates to help cover the cost of liquor in the community. At that point, they did include impacts on the police department as well, and various things to a very small degree, because there is a cost to having liquor in the community. And it also adopted a CPI adjustment at that time. Between 2003 and later, the state passed a law requiring that any tax on the hospitality industry in excess of other taxes be used to support that industry. Obviously, this was in our general fund. We spend significant money in our general fund over this time period each year for special events and tourism and those type of things, so we were in compliance with that. But in July 1st of 2015, fiscal year 2016, the tourism was moved out of the general fund, and at that time, the license fee, the annual license fee for liquor license, was also moved out of the general fund and put into the bed tax fund, where those items are today, which could lead into some of your discussion today. So with that, I've also put up the list of the different categories of liquor licenses on the screen. One thing to point out, all the items are annual licenses except for the first item, which is actually an application fee. It's a one-time fee that's applied to somebody who applies for a liquor license or a transfer or those type of things. And that fee is intended to help cover the cost of the city clerk's time, the community development time, the police department time, all the internal people that have to review those new liquor licenses. But all the other fees are annual fees, and all of them do go into the bed tax fund, which is used for all of our tourism expenditures now, including the department. With that, I turn it over for discussion.
So is the special events under any of those categories?
Yeah, whatever special event spending there is also coming out of the bed tax fund.
Okay, so
there is some in the,
none of these fees here actually apply to them, people that are putting on special events, or is that the very first one where they come in and apply for a?
No. Mayor Oberg, the special event fee is a one-time or per day fee, $62 per day, and that's just applied to whoever comes in to take a special event.
And I think you have someplace in the history that this actually goes back to 1933.
Yes, actually the first fees were implemented in 1933, and then in 1965 is when they passed an ordinance to go along and categorize them with the way the state categorized the liquor licenses.
Okay. Any questions, comments from the council?
Yes. Oh, Mr. Mayor?
Go ahead.
If I may. I don't know if anybody's aware, but not since 1965, but as far as I can remember, in the past 10 years, this has been, my knowledge has been that this council, or the council at any given year, has promised to bring this to council to decide whether this is arbitrary or if it's beneficiary to the city. And actually, Mark, you kind of sealed my argument up. When we weren't allowed to take $70,000 and give it to the general fund, which supported the police or enforcement of liquor law, laws and licensees, given the fact, and that's set alone, that these are arbitrary fees, because the guy that's going to the mini mart getting his Colt 45 is probably more of a danger than somebody that's having a beer in their hotel, which is totally out of whack. So in my mind, it's unfair, because now we've got, this could have said, the state could have said, you know what, you can't use this $70,000 in general fund, it could only go to streets. And then we'd go, as a government entity, going, oh, we ain't giving up that $70,000, that's going to go to streets. We just refuse to give it up, and we transfer from one to the other. From my understanding, from, I think Allison put this out, if we were to cut this $70,000 out of the tourism budget, it affects it by 10%. I don't see a problem with shaving 10% from everybody that's getting a fee.
I did some number crunching. It's at less than 6%, with our overall budget being $1,205,222. It's less than 6%, and I agree, Greg. There had to be two of us put this on for conversation, and you and I came forward to do it, and I just think it's an arbitrary fee. We talked about the fact several years ago when the business license went down in defeat that if there was a business license put in place, the liquor license would be one that would go away instead of just adding another license onto a license. And you know, I'd hate to think that we'd have a fee put on jewelry just because somebody had enough money to go in and buy a piece of jewelry. And I look at it being that arbitrary, that we don't need that fee. We can reduce 6%. You know, I go back to some of these things, bed tax allowances. I go back to some of them. Back in fiscal year 15, we had $755,000, and now fiscal year 17, we're at $1,205,000. In 2 years, we've increased that much. My standpoint, I think the liquor community, the restaurants, the bars, the brew pubs, whatever you want to call it, I think they're here. They're part of our tourism group, and they're part of people that are hospitality group, and I think that we're charging them way unfairly opposed to many other businesses that do the same thing.
And to add on to that, Mr. Mayor, if I could, you know, we put this under the umbrella of tourism, and let's say I'm the little market up there by the old Fry's. They're not getting diddly from tourism unless somebody maybe be driving up there to grab a six-pack to look at the overlook. But then they're in violation for drinking a six-pack, and it doesn't go back to enforcement. So they're paying, I think, $300 and some. You know, it's just, these are numbers pulled out of nowhere. Microbrewery is 178. I guess when you're a microbrewery consumer, you're less of a problem than somebody that is here that maybe uses Tommy's Place or something. I just, again, I think it's unfair. I think it's unnecessary.
Councilwoman Orr.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Council, as you know, I serve as the representative on the Tourism Advisory Committee, and I've enjoyed that position very much. I've learned a lot about what our TAC does, how they have brought many tourists into our city, and they cannot operate without funds. And certainly, we just can't take from our general fund and just shove into tourism. So I believe, and I have talked to many of the operators as far as those that own bars, and I've asked, just simply, do you not think, if your license is $662, do you not think, don't you get that much from the tourism annually? That's one annual fee, $662. Don't you believe that you get that many tourists, especially if you're around the square, or if you're doing anything around activities that come here weekend after weekend? And I believe that we can show, and I have, and I read this a couple months ago, and I'd like to read it again. The Tourism Office can directly track $1.7 million in revenue generated, a return on investment of 3 to 1. And we have multiple research projects that show an average return on investments of $7 to $8 for each dollar. That is huge to our community. And so I certainly would not object to, and I was hoping that a proposal was going to come forward to say, well, let's look at these. Should we maybe move these around? Should a special event pay more than, what'd you say, Dana, $62?
$62 a day.
So should that be $100? Should that be $125? Can we look at those numbers? Can we make this more fair? But just to say, let's just let this go, because we don't need those funds anymore, because those funds, I said when I took this office, I will look through everything through the lens of what is best for Prescott, not as what is best for 5 or 6 or 7 people. And I believe to this community, the return on investments of $7 or $8 to $1 for a liquor license is a good investment for our city. And so I just, again, I would not be against, I'd be happy to work with the group. The idea has been suggested in the TAC is that we look at balancing this a little bit, maybe add more to that special event or take something away for some. But just to say, this isn't unfair, this is arbitrary, let's just take it away, I think it's a misrepresentation of what's been done with that money.
Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. I don't know why every time something like this comes up, Blair's got to come in about jewelry. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Blair goes up and buys that goofy-looking dog of his, dog food over here at Shiska's, and the dog food gets transferred over on the courthouse square, which creates a health and safety issue for everybody. And all he does is complain about it. I don't know why he always talks about my jewelry. I will say this: I oppose taxing certain classes of business simply because you can. Now, last time we discussed this, I brought up the fact that I thought at one time in history, the logic of the liquor tax was because of the impact it put on police and fire in the community with regards to responding to DUIs and accidents and blah, blah, blah. And I was promptly told, oh, no, you're wrong. That isn't why that happens. So from that perspective, it looks just like an excuse to tax one group of people. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it at all. I think you get taxed for what you do. And if the liquor industry is not creating a demand on public safety personnel, why are we taxing them? The idea of, they collect sales tax too. They collect the same sales tax that I do. They also pay for the privilege to be there to the state. So here again, we set up a special tax simply because we could. And I don't agree with that at all.
Councilwoman Wilcox.
I'd like to go back to this argument that this tax is arbitrary, and Mark, you probably know better than anybody else. Where did these numbers come from, the amount of the tax per classification?
As I recall, and again, this is over 15 years ago that we last looked at these, but as I recall, they correlated close to differential from what the state charged annually. So if a microbrewery was charged less than a restaurant, so ours were distributed in that same rationale. Back 15 years ago, I don't know what they are today, but that's how they did it.
And then a second question for the two gentlemen in the big black hat and the big white hat out there. Well, probably when the mayor calls upon, yeah, but just something for you to get out your calculator about. If we're talking about percentages of the tourism budget, I'm really curious about what percentage is $662 of your net income from your bar? Well, I don't expect you to, but I think it's kind of small. I think it's pretty small. That's all.
Anything else?
Nope.
Councilman Shiska.
Thank you, Mayor. There's pie in the sky, and then there's reality. And the reality is the $70,000 or $80,000, whatever it is. Part of that $80,000 paid for Kayla's hands, or part of the other money paid for Kayla's hands. So to say the money goes to some in the sky up there marketing fund, advertising fund, is not exactly true. However, what I would like to do is to make it more fair for the people selling liquor. I would like to, one of the things about the things we think, say, and do in Rotary is it fair to all concerned? And I have to be honest with you, I would like to work with the bar owners and the people selling liquor to come up with a reasonable alternative that would benefit them and benefit us.
Councilwoman Orr.
Yeah, I'd just like to finalize this for myself is that, you know, with the bed tax, we compete. We compete with Flagstaff, we compete with Sedona. Flagstaff has 6 people in their tourism department. Sedona, their bed tax is 4%. I'm sorry, 3.5. Flagstaff is 4%. So we have to compete. These are our tourists, and this is a big deal to this community because our tourism is extremely important. And I know can you really prove that what you're doing in the tourism department is bringing in tourists? Well, I don't want to take that gamble that we don't invest this money and see whether or not our tourism takes a dive, because there are people everywhere asking, begging for tourists to come to their communities. We have a lot to offer here in Prescott, but they just don't come here because we're Prescott. They come here because we tell them what we're doing. There's a huge presence online, and so all of this costs us money. This is a revenue generator for us, and I certainly don't want to cut revenue from our city.
Councilman Blair?
It's a weak revenue generator at best. And a selective group of people. I don't buy that for 1 minute. You know, you go back to the allocation of the bed tax back in 2015. All these organizations, whether it's the Jazz Summit, Whiskey Row Marathon, none of them at that point were receiving $1 from the city of Prescott. Now all of a sudden, in the 16 budget and then also in the 17 budget, each one of those years that money goes up and up and up. We had carryover from year to year to year. So in 2015, when our economy was still doing well, and it still is doing well, we spent, you know, the incoming cash balance was $200,000. Now all of a sudden we have an incoming cash balance of $313,000, but yet we feel inclined, because we're government, that we want to spend every friggin' penny of that thing. And we're unwilling to take a 6% cut across the board. Instead of giving Whiskey Row Marathon $30,000, we can't cut them 6% and take $1,800 to make it what's fair to this community and our business people that are generating the funds. I think that's just wrong. I don't care how you look at it. Somebody came to me and said, hey, we're going to charge you a special tax because you sell blinds. I'd look at them and say, are you crazy? That's what we've done to these people.
Mark, what's the difference between this fee and charging the BBB? Would it be a difference?
As far as expanding the bed tax to a bed, board, and booze tax,
yeah,
that would take a vote of the public, I believe.
So let's do that.
Okay, and is that more expensive than?
Well, the BBB.
That would be more expensive to the bar owners than what they're currently
Well,
paying.
it would obviously depend on what it's set at, but it would definitely be more than most of these annual fees, I'm sure.
You guys want to make us all privileged of what you're saying?
So as I understand it,
I have to laugh about this because, in one, it's an arbitrary foisting off a fee on to business owners, and the other one is the ask of the public, will you support this? There's two different ways to get there, and this is not the way to get there.
Well, I guess, you know, the thing I worry about, too, is if you remove this fee, then why are we charging bed tax?
Yeah.
If you want to be fair to one, you need to be fair to all.
That's right.
I agree.
So are we going to then just cut out everything we have for tourism?
We went to the public,
promotion?
Mayor. We went to the public, Mayor, and asked them if we could tax that group of people, and the public voted on that. They did not vote on the bar fee.
You know, Mayor, what we were talking about was in the, if in fact it was a BBB, then it would be a pass-through. The bar owners would charge their patrons the tax. But right now it's pass-through. Because ultimately the bar owners are looking at their bottom line and they're saying, what do I have to charge for a drink in order to survive? So maybe BBB is more of a direct pass-through, but certainly it would probably cost the bar owners more. And the liquor fee right now is a pass-through in the end. That's what we were talking about.
Okay, we got 5 minutes left. I'll give two people 2.5 minutes.
I feel slighted on the time because I'm going to take longer than 2.5 minutes.
You only get 2.5.
No,
That's
I
all
don't think that's very fair, but I'll do my best. We let 7 people come up for the first topic, and that took a long time. Anyway, I won't argue with you. It's just, this is important to us. I want to thank Greg Lozelle and Steve Blair for putting us on the agenda. As Lamerson and Blair will remember, we were talking about this back when Steve Norwood was the city manager. And we had a meeting with Steve Norwood and Marlon at Lizards way back then, about 8 of us, and they joined us. And they agreed it's an unfair tax to us. But it's never gone away. I had a meeting yesterday with the chief of police and John on a different topic that maybe will be coming forward to you at some point, hopefully soon. And I joked with John after the meeting. I said, John, it's not about the money. He goes, that's what they always say, Dave. Well, you know what? It's not about the money. It's about why are we being singled out. If every business in this town paid the $662, I would not be standing here. I guarantee it. We already pay a lot of money to the state. We have a lot of other licenses that nobody else pays. That isn't even the issue. And to your point, Billy, why is it just us that benefit from the tourism? Every retail business in this town benefits from tourism. If I'm running an ad and somebody comes to Palace for lunch from somewhere else, and they're walking past Jim's store, I hate to pick on you, Jim, and well, this isn't picking on you, but it is about jewelry, and they because they came to Palace, they happened to be walking down Cortez, because I got him here, and they spent $1,000 in his store. He benefited from that tourism too. So I just don't know why the burden falls on us. Every retail business in the store, to some extent, benefits from tourism. So why are we the only ones paying that fee? It's just not right. It hasn't been right all along. And I just want to make that clear. It's not right. And, I'm not touting the Palace, but the Palace has been here a lot longer than I have. I'd like to think that the last 20 years I've enhanced it. But 2 years ago, it was named one of the top 10 historic bars in the nation by USA Today. That's good for Prescott. It's good for the businesses in Prescott because it brought people here. So my main point is we're not the only ones that benefit for tourism. Every retail store in this town does. And you know what? As a group, we probably spend more money on advertising already than most. Maybe the car dealers spend more money. I don't know. They have a lot of money. But we spend a lot of money already on our own to get people here, more than probably most businesses, just because of what we are. So once again, I'm not up here to whine. It's just it's not fair that we're the only ones paying it. You want to make everybody pay it? So be it. That would be fair. But not just us. We bring a lot of people to town because of what we are. I'm not bragging. I don't mean just me. I mean the hospitality, restaurants and bars. They're social places. We bring a lot of people to this town, and we pay a lot of sales tax, which is no problem paying. We're happy to do it. But, everybody benefits from the tourism, not just us. And I just want to read this real quick.
We don't have time. You just ran out of your 2.5 minutes. So.
Can I yield a minute? Can I just have
next person.
Can I have 30 seconds?
We got somebody else who wants to come on up. Thanks.
Everybody knows Dave. I'm Cindy Gresser. I'm the executive director of the Smoke Eye Museum. I'm a member of the Tourism Advisory Committee. I sit on the Arizona Citizens for the Arts Board of Trustees. I am a member of the Prescott Area Arts and Humanities Council, and I serve as your chairman for the Public Arts Committee for the City of Prescott. I'm here to tell you that the arts and culture sector of our community returns 2.5 times the money that we receive. For that $80,000 that's on there, you're going to get $240,000 back. It's been proven time and time again in the 2011 study and most recently in the 2014 study. We bring in jobs, we bring in money, and to take that money out of the bed tax budget, you're hurting yourselves. Whether these fees are fair for our liquor distributors, I cannot speak to that. They, I would believe, have the greatest impact on public safety within the city. I don't know that for a fact either, but I am telling you that as you take money out of bed tax funds, you are taking money away from the city 2.5 times over. I don't think that's a bad return on the investment. $80,000 a year between how many different organizations there, and if our state decided in 1965 that we should be taxing liquor selling organizations, I think we should continue to do so until they reform that. And I'll yield the rest of my time, but I am happy to give this to you, sir.
Okay, thanks.
As evidence of what the arts and culture does for this city. We do it, we've proved it locally, we've provided you with return on investment statistics from our sector, and I think you need to pay attention to that. Thank you.
30 seconds, that's it.
By the way, the museums also benefit from tourism because people driving from the Palace going home, they go to Smoke Eye Museum maybe.
They come for our events to go to your bar.
Good, then you can help pay the $662, and then we'll be even. Real quickly, this was a letter written in 2011 from Craig McConnell, I wish he was here, but he's not, to Lex Gwynn, who owns Lizards, who was the president of PI. But just real quickly, the city's fiscal year 2012 budget adopted in 2011 includes $70,000 in anticipated revenues from these fees. Also accurately pointed out by your letter, Senate Bill 1460, the 2011 omnibus bill, liquor bill, now restricts the use of these fees for tourist promotion, only for tourist promotion, it should have said. The city is complying and satisfying these restrictions. But real quickly here, I have the FY16 updated applications where money goes. This was supposed to be started in 2011. In 2013, 14, and 15, that $70,000 isn't even on the budget. So they managed without it then. So where did it go? Because it was supposed to be there and it wasn't. So you don't need to answer that question. You might not know the answers, but here it is. They didn't start it till 2016. So it's gone. Thank you. I appreciate the extra 30 seconds. Yeah.
Okay, go to the last slide, please.
Item D, request for information regarding September 27, 2016 voting meeting agenda items.
Any questions, comments on what we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes?
No, Mayor. I guess go back to the other one. Are we going to come back to this? Or are we going to discuss it later? Or?
Put it on the council agenda.
Mr. Mayor, there's one other person that would like to speak. Who's standing there?
How much time do you need?
5 seconds, if that.
Okay,
So
you got 5
it's
seconds.
Really quick. My name is Michael Kuvalas. I'm the owner of the Hacienda Inn. I've dealt with many communities on the BBB tax, and everybody that has spoken today is correct. This is not a correct fee. The revenue that's generated is not only sales tax revenue, but also it goes to the marketing of Prescott and affects all of our businesses. What I'd ask is that you please take a look at this again, where there's actually time to educate, because this is what we do as a living. We'd like to be able to present you with actual hard evidence of what this does and how it does. The bar owners should not be paying these. It should be coming from a BBB tax, which is generating revenue, which should generate your sales tax as well, and be a win-win for everybody. There's no one that has said anything up here that has been inaccurate. We just need to provide you with more information so you can make an educated decision. That's all I'd like to ask, if at all possible.
Right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Greg, we'll go ahead and put this on a future voting. Yeah. Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you for coming. 10 minutes, we'll start the next meeting.